Now we're going to look at the international newspapers now then here on France 24, and Elena is with us. You're starting in Egypt today, aren't you, after both the candidates there claiming election victory?
Indeed, Egypt in life or death struggle over future, headlines The Guardian. Of course, this is after the military council that's ruling Egypt severely limited the powers of whatever president now gets elected by declaring it has the power to veto clauses of the future constitution and to bring in laws. It has legislative power, it says. Now, they seem to be setting itself up for a collision course with the Muslim Brothers, the paper explains, because if Mohammed Morsi wins, then there might be an enormous showdown between the Islamists and the army over who exactly has the power to nominate the Constituent Assembly. It's going to write the new constitution, to make laws, and so on. Now, they say there's two ways of looking at this, essentially. On the one hand, the army has won this battle. They've got the guns and the institutions, so if Morsi is appointed president, it's going to be him who's going to have to come to an accommodation with them, rather than the other way around, because they're still looking at things from a position of power. The editorial, though, says that even if the military council planned all along to usurp parliament by having the court declare it invalid and then seize the presidency, they could hardly have approached it in a more cat-handed way. It's been a bit of a comedy of errors. They've probably even boosted Morsi's vote by moving as they did at the weekend before the polls had closed even. And so maybe some within the army might be realising that they've probably overplayed their hand. They've made themselves even more unpopular than they already were. Those Egyptians who were saying a week ago there's no difference between Muslim Brothers and the army, probably seeing a difference now that they've made this power grab. And they reckon there's some differences of opinion within the generals as well. There's a hardline faction and a faction that realises they might have gone too far. So then Morsi might have some room to play with to reach negotiations with them.
What about the newspapers actually in Egypt itself?
Well, the Arabist blog is looking at what Morsi ought to do once elected. Of course, he's not been officially declared the winner, so even though polls look like he's come out on top, they express a fear that the army could still attempt to steal the election effectively and pronounce Shafiq victor whether or not he has actually won or not, which would be like Algeria in 1991, where the government then refused to recognise the election result because Islamists had won, and it led to a civil war. So they've got quite an apocalyptic scenario in that paper for what could potentially still happen. If Morsi is declared president, though, they say there's two options. It could be a major confrontation with the army or a kind of Pakistani-style uneasy civil-military cooperation, which could go on for years. The Egypt Independent, though, on its part, says that the distinction between the army and the Muslim Brotherhood is really not very significant at all. The next government is going to pit Egypt's institutions, the president, the parliament, and the army, against the will of its people, who didn't seek this outcome in general. And so it's going to be up to the revolutionaries to kind of come up with a better practical solution to come back onto the streets and change the situation.
OK, that's Egypt. Let's move to Greece now. Of course, these negotiations still going on to try and form some kind of government. What are the papers saying about that?
Well, Kati Marini's pretty optimistic this morning that a three-way coalition can be formed, so that would be between New Democracy, Socialist PASOK and the small left-wing party Democratic Left. The Independent, though, has got a profile of Antonis Samaras, who New Democracy leader, who'd be Prime Minister in that situation. It's not very flattering. They call him a lightweight and a populist, and they say the Conservative Party spent a number of years in political exile under his leadership, and that he's been blamed for bringing down the technocratic government of Lucas Papademos before it could carry out as many significant reforms as it wanted to. So not a very flattering profile of him. They reckon that whatever coalition he puts together, it might fall very quickly indeed. A point of view that's agreed with by the Kati Marini deputy editor who's writing for The Guardian today. He reckons Syriza are going to be the winners of this election in the end, because they'll be able to position themselves as a strong opposition against this coalition, and then if it collapses within 6 months, which he reckons is going to happen, they'll get a big majority in another election.
OK, and you're also looking at the environmental summit opening tomorrow in Rio.
Yeah, something that's been quite badly sidelined by all of the G20 and Egypt and Greek news, but it is actually quite important, as the Huffington Post is trying to point out today. They say it's a big difference from the Rio summit 20 years ago that this is the anniversary of. That was the summit that finally put environmental issues at the centre of world politics. Now, they're not really in the centre anymore. The environmentalist activist George Monbiot, writing in his Guardian column today, says that nothing has changed since then. The 1992 summit was just the beginning of an endless series of summits about the environment in which people have talked promising nonsense, according to him, in an impressive number of languages without actually doing anything. Each summit just leads to another summit, which leads to another summit, and Barack Obama's government, for example, now is actually less keen on signing up to environmental regulation than the government under the Republican presidency of the first George Bush was 20 years ago. So we've actually gone backwards.
Summititis there from Elena Casas in the international newspapers. Thanks a lot.